Hi folks, this is take two. In the previous videos I have explained a few of the prerequisites that I think will help us understand Lefebvre's sort of theoretical trajectory of urban history. And in this section I'm going to begin to introduce that history. In particular, I will talk about the 0 point and the political city. As you can see in the presentation here, that this is a recreation and small adaptation of Lefebvre's graph, which goes from a 0 point of absolutely no urban presence of the urban to a world that is entirely urban, right? The Trantor, Isaac Asimov Trantor planet city kind of world. And he suggests that there are a series of transitions, marked transitions, that get us from the 0 point of no urban to the 100% mark of completely urban. In this video, I'm going to cover the 0 point and the political city, and then I will continue in subsequent videos. The 0 point refers to this idea of pre-urban settlements, a kind of hunter-gatherer, nomadic kind of existence for humanity, in which the first human beings would move about the world, marking it out and naming its spaces through their exploration, right? So here you can see, for example, the sort of nomadic, migratory aboriginals of Australia, named turn this one mountain, Ayers Rock or Uluru, naming it Uluru, as a sacred space, right, in their world, and marking, in essence, marking this otherwise empty space, right? And by empty I mean disconnected to human conception, because the rock was there for a long time. Then humans came along and put it in relation to, by conceptually put it in relation to other spaces, and that's what this 0 point, this pre-urban 0 point of just marking out spaces and putting them in relation to each other, is what humanity did. To the extent that they did settle down, of course, and begin to produce agriculture, it was little more than just a gathering of people coming together to serve their own needs, typically on the basis of kinship, right? So it would be a large extended family unit that would settle together. So at this point, there is no urban per se, because in essence the urban emerges with the emergence of stronger and more distinct power relations within a society. And with that, Lefebvre marks the beginning of the urban by discussing the emergence of the political city. And he makes an interesting and to me quite compelling argument that the traditional classical view and version of the emergence of cities is ideological, which is another way again of those in power shaping the world to continue to reinforce that power. So this classical ideological story of the emergence of the urban is that as agriculture grew, as our settlements prospered, as they had more offspring and the population increased, or they allowed other people to join them, that they slowly became urban, right? You know, somebody may be specialized in making tools or barrels or bags or clothing or something like this. And the emergence of this kind of artisanal specialization and the kind of trade that automatically engenders, right? That people would trade bags for food or something like this, represents the emergence of the urban. And that once the urban emerges, they serve as centers for collective organization and mutual protection. The argument being that cities emerge because people come together and they organize themselves to manage their own local resources, but perhaps most importantly at first, to protect themselves against invasions from outsiders. Because there were still tribes, nomadic hunter tribes, that would go around and invade these places and steal their stores, etc., right? And so that's the kind of classical story. But what that does, and the reason it's ideological, I think, for Lefebvre, he doesn't spell this out, but the reason I think it's ideological is that in naturalizing is because that naturalizes the evolution of the urban and thus the evolution of power relations. Because by saying that cities accrete slowly and evolve slowly out of clusters into villages and flower into cities, it presents a kind of organic, natural, inevitable development of the urban. Whereas, and what that does is that also simultaneously naturalizes the emergence of the power relations that we have in the city, right? Because the urban emerges naturally, so the fact that we have lords or kings or heads of cities and the emerging hierarchical relations is also naturalized, so that it's natural that somebody should be superior to others, right? And if we accept that, then that puts us in a particular set of social relations, of power relations vis-a-vis other people, right? So to that extent, it naturalizes existing power relations. However, there is an alternative version of the story which builds out of Pierre Clastres' Society of the State, Society Against the State, which is a really compelling book about Indian, Native Americans, or indigenous tribes in South America, deliberately organizing their society to make it difficult for hierarchical power relations to emerge, right? They deliberately undermine and disable those in positions of power from being able to abuse and accumulate power. And so Lefebvre, along with Deleuze and Guattari and others, build on this notion and the other notions that appear in Pierre Clastres, to argue that agriculture was actually formalized by urban centers, right? The idea is that urban centers pre-exist, in a sense, the state. So the idea here being that those nomadic hunter tribes would settle down and create for themselves a kind of military fortification and base from which they would go out and collect tribute from the agricultural villages around them, right? So because the hunter-gatherers, the hunters in particular, had superior military strength because they're hunters, right? Or spears, whatever it is they're using, not only do they probably have more and better quality military weaponry, but they also have more practice and skill in using them, which allows them to extort the villages around them and take tribute, and therefore to not have to work, right? And in essence, what they do is they, in order to live off of the agricultural communities around them, they protect those communities from other groups that would come in, while they exploit them by taking the resources to live their quality lives, and additionally oppress them by administrating their communities, right? They impose the urban centers, the hunters in the urban centers impose their rules and demands on the agricultural producers through the extraction of tribute. In a sense, one can think of this as a kind of mafia-style protection racket, right? The mafia, in many instances would protect a neighborhood and the businesses in a neighborhood from damage, right? So they would go into a business and say, you should pay us, the mafia, $100 a month to provide protection to you, right? Because it would be a real shame if somebody were to come in here and destroy your business, right? You need our protection to make sure that nobody comes in and destroys your business, so pay us, right? But of course, if you don't pay, who is it that goes in and destroys your business? The mafia, right? So you have to pay the mafia to protect your business from being destroyed by the mafia. And one can think about this emergence of the political city in precisely this manner, right? That the nomads, the hunters, establish a protection racket among the surrounding agricultural units, and so we get the emergence of a sort of early kind of state, right, in which the city itself forms a hierarchical government that asserts itself over the surrounding territory and functions as a kind of proto-state. And in doing so, of course, in establishing this clear hierarchical set of class relations, right? The powerful and the less powerful, the rulers and the ruled, the hunters and the farmers. You get the establishment of an initial kind of class society and the initial struggles that we still face today, and we still deal with or engage in today. But either way, this political city represents the emergence of a kind of proto-state. And as a political city, it serves as a center of power. And this power can take on a multitude of forms. The two primary forms that it would take on are religious and military. Here we have an example of one of the most famous religious cities and centers in East Asia. Maybe you know this place. If you haven't, you should put it on your bucket list of places to go. This is Angkor Wat near Siem Reap in Cambodia, and is part of a wide temple complex which was part of a wide agricultural kingdom that had a strong local presence, but also a very extensive control on in the Cambodian territory, in that whole Southeast Asian region, right? So, and they ruled primarily as religious leaders, right? Which doesn't mean that they didn't have military accoutrements as well, right? Here's another couple of examples of political cities. You got Seoul here, and here I think is the Forbidden Palace in Beijing, that established themselves as political centers of power. And these centers are initially populated primarily by priests, warriors, princes, nobles, military leaders, right? This kind of elite group of people who manage the sort of physical aspects of a society, in the case of the military and the princes, and the sort of ideological piece of it in the form of the priests. But this emergence of this establishment of these new powers also create conditions for the emergence of a new set of powers that would struggle against them. And Lefebvre suggests that it emerges this way, right? That in order to stay in power, the political city required advanced weaponry. It had to be on the cutting edge of military weaponry. And in order to do that, it required high-quality artisanship. People had to be able to craft high-quality weapons. And it also had to engage in trade in order to get materials that it needed to build the finest weapons, right? Obsidian is one of these early examples of a good that was deeply traded and involved in weaponry. Secondly, I'm adding this piece, that in any class society there are also always status markers, and those, like crowns, like fancy outfits, like earrings, dresses, fancy cups, fancy bowls, etc., all of the stuff that you can see in a museum, right? If you go back to the Shilla Kingdom stuff, right? Almost all of the stuff that are preserved in museums are status markers, right? These are things from rich people. And those things require also a great deal of artisanship to construct them. Some of them are incredibly finely crafted. And trade in order to obtain the rare items that would mark somebody's status. So we have the emergence of craftspeople and merchants, right? Finally, it also, right, this power also requires command at a distance. And I'm drawing this, if you're interested, from Lewis Mumford's notion of the mega machine. That all of these kingdoms, once they get large enough, there has to be a way to communicate the will of the ruler to the farthest reaches of his or her kingdom, right? So what typically happens is we get the emergence of writing to be able to convey these this will, right? And you can see this in the emergence of hieroglyphs in Egypt and other places, right? But in doing so, this requires the presence of scribes and administrators to coordinate all of these activities and to communicate their ideas. So you get the emergence of a kind of academic or intellectual class as well in this. Let me, before we get to how this actually spatially leads to the emergence of new powers, let me note that under the political city, the official ownership of the land is always the eminent right of the monarch, but the effective possession of land is in the hands of the peasants, right? That is, that even though the king owns title and to all of the land, it's really the peasants who are there and using it and control that land, albeit subject to the demands of the sovereign. So when we think about the spatial organization of these political cities, we can think about the palaces. I mean, this is the head temple. You can think about the palaces here in Seoul or the Forbidden City. But we also can think of other political spaces, right? The center of these communities are the agora or forums in which political debate takes place. And these cities tend to be spatially organized around the center of decision making, whether that's the palace or the agora or some other form. While the trade, and this is where we get to the transition, right? Exchange and trade, because it involved outsiders, strangers, these people were kept outside of the political city, right? We don't want strangers getting too close to the center of power because they're potentially dangerous and and they're not part of us. They're different, right? So markets and exchange would take place in deliberately separate heterotopic spaces of marketplaces, typically outside of the city walls, right? And this, as trade grows, these market spaces outside of the walls and whatnot also increase. But they are functionally distinct from the political city or the center of the political city. And by having that kind of outside space, right, trade in particular, merchants in particular, were more flexible and mobile. And so they could, and had to, in order to trade, they had to leave the city, they had to travel to other cities and back. So they were not necessarily required to come back to any city, right? So in essence, as traders and merchants built their capital, built their wealth, they developed a countervailing source of power that was emerging outside of the political city. And in essence, this power, the power and the mobility of wealth, threatens the political city and leads to the emergence of the mercantile city, which I will talk about in the next video.